Okay, I should be live. So, hi to anyone watching. My name is Riley. I am a developer advocate here at Gadget. And today I'm going to go through the first of our launch week webinars, which will be building a CI and CD pipeline using GGT and GitHub Actions. So, this is the third day of launch week. Day one, we announced unlimited dev environments and all Gadget apps. We now have support for source control. That was day two. And day three, today, we announced the enhanced GGT command line tool. And using all of these together will allow you to build a continuous integration and continuous delivery pipeline for your Gadget apps, which is pretty sweet. So I'm going to start by walking through some quick intro slides, and then we'll just get right to the building. So what is a CI/CD pipeline? Just in case you need a refresher or aren't sure what it is, it's just a way to automate some processes that aim to improve software quality and deliver new versions of software to end users. So this is let's automate some tests and deploy to production when those tests pass. For example, we can automatically run tests when we merge into our main branch. If all the tests pass, we want to deploy right to production. We can also set up, when I open up a pull request to merge code changes from a branch into my main branch, we can also set it up so tests run at that point as well. I'm not going to touch on that explicitly in this webinar, but I'll go through the basics and tell you how you can kind of modify what we have if that's what you want to do. There we go. So CI/CD with Gadget. So this is what we're going to be doing. So now that you can have unlimited development environments, we can take advantage of this to create a staging or CI test environment. And so what we're going to do, I'm going to take my normal development environment, my personal environment. I'm going to use GGT Dev to pull everything down to my local machine. We now have source control enabled, so I'm going to push my Gadget project to GitHub. And then I'm going to use GitHub Actions. And what I'm going to do is make sure I push up all of my changes from my main branch to my new staging environment. I'm going to run some automated tests on that environment. And then I am going to deploy automatically if those tests pass. And so you can see I've kind of labeled all of the new GGT commands we're using. GGT Dev is the same as GGT Sync if you used it before. It's just going to keep my hosted Gadget environment and my local project in sync with one another. GGT Push is going to push from my Git repo to that staging environment, so everything will stay up to date and I'll be running tests on my latest code. Run tests actually has a GGT pull in it. I'll point that out later. I don't explicitly have it here on this diagram. And then GGT deploy will deploy, and it'll deploy my staging environment to production. So, perfect. Not a lot of slides. Let's get to building. I already have a project set up here. It's just a version of our product tagger tutorial. You can check out other videos on YouTube or our written tutorial if you're interested in how to build this. But I already have a development version right here and a production version set up. So you can see they do have slightly different names. In fact, if I refresh this one, you should be able to see the production one. Yeah, so we have tag products auto magically and then tag prod auto magically. And the one that just says prod is my production deployment. And so what I'm going to want to do is make changes here in my development instance, push my changes to my main branch in Git, and automatically deploy them on this production version. So that's great. My first step is pulling down this project to my local machine, and I'm going to use GGT to do that. So I can just hover over this little cloud and I get this command. I can just run this in my terminal. And what this will do is pull down this Gadget project to my local environment. It's already working. Looks like everything is up to date and the project is pulled down. So I'm just going to pop open a new tab. Make this a bit bigger here. You can excuse my weird directory where I have multiple versions of Gadget. That's just how life is right now. Perfect. So this is my Gadget project. I can go ahead and open this in VS Code. Make this a bit bigger. And you can see this mirrors my Gadget project in the web editor. I have my API file for all of my backend code. I can see I have my models, including my Shopify models. I've got my custom allowed tag model. And what was included as part of the source control release is we have these metadata files. So if I click on this, this is a schema file, and this captures the contents of my model, or the field definitions of my model definition, if you will. So I can see I have a keyword field, it's a string type, and I have a validation. So I will get all of these for every single model. My Shopify models look a little different. There's not captured in fields, but instead in Shopify fields. That's a-okay. I can now go ahead and push this project to GitHub just to go ahead and create a starting point for myself. So that's what I'm going to do next. So I'm going to go ahead. I'll just go git init, and I'm going to create a new repo in GitHub. Let's just go new repo. And I'll just call this tag products automagically. Perfect. I'm just going to make this private for now. And I will create this repo. So I am just going to go ahead, run some of these guys, set main to my main branch, add the origin, and I will go ahead and just push everything to main by making a first commit. I'll just call this first commit. I'll run this guy just so I don't have to. Oh. Perfect. Okay. So now if I refresh, I have my Gadget project files here in Git. So that's fantastic. So now any changes I make can be captured in Git. If I want to go ahead and create a branch, do some stuff, add a model, add code, change some of my connection configuration, I can go ahead and do that, push it to that branch, and then let's say I want to fix a bug, I can flick back to main, start a new branch, fix my bug, merge into my main, and go back to working on my feature. So it is just a full source control. You can use Git how you normally do. That is pretty groovy. It's really awesome for working with teams as well. If you're not a solo developer, you can work with Git as a team like you normally do. So that's awesome. So now that I've got my things in Git, I want to take advantage of GitHub Actions. So there's this Actions tab here. And this is where I will go ahead and run my processes. I got nothing there yet. So I'm going to flip back to Gadget. There's something I need to do before I start building my GitHub action. And that is that I need that staging environment. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new development environment here. I'm just going to call this staging. I am going to choose to clone my development environment, which is my main environment. I could also clone prod if I want. And when I go ahead and create this new staging environment, it's going to copy over all of the models, code, and configuration from my development environment. You do notice that there's no Shopify client credentials available. We get this nice big yellow warning. And that's because my Shopify connection definition is copied over. If I go ahead and click Add Credentials, I can see I have my access scopes and data models included, but I am not connected to an app. So that is just one thing you need to be aware of. So that's fantastic. I have this staging environment. So this is the environment that I want to push my changes to, run my tests on, and then deploy from my staging to production. Right now in Gadget, you can't deploy from GitHub. You always need to deploy from an environment to production. So this staging will be where my code is pushed before it is deployed to prod. I will just flip back to my, we already have a production deployment here. I will just flip back to development. One other thing I'll note actually while I'm on staging, because I have my GGT dev command running, what I copied from this little cloud icon, I can see that GGT is running on a different environment. So This will just allow me to get back to my working environment quickly and gives me a little visual indicator that alerts me that if I am making changes in staging manually, they won't be reflected in my local environment because I'm pointing GGT towards development. So that is fantastic. So I've got my staging environment set up. I am ready to, let's just go through a simple deploy first before we start running tests. So what we need to do, if I open up my project here in VS Code, I can go ahead and create a new folder. This will just be a .github / workflows, if I can spell it correctly. Perfect. So with this GitHub workflows directory, I can write YAML files which define my GitHub actions, which will define my CI/CD pipeline. I'm just going to go ahead and add a file, and I'll call it main.yaml. So that is great. So now in this file, I can go ahead and define my GitHub actions so that something runs automatically. So I'm just going to copy over a bit of code here and paste it in and then walk through it. Watching me write YAML is the opposite of exciting. So let's walk through this now. This is all stuff that's available in the GitHub Actions documentation, by the way. So if you have questions about any of the syntax or I'm not explaining something enough, go check out their docs because everything is there. This is just going to be the name of my job. I'm just going to call this deploy to production. So all I'm going to do at first is when I make a change in development, push my changes to my main branch in Git, which is defined by this on here. I want to go ahead and run this job. So I only have one job right now. It's called deploy. And this is just kind of how I am defining what's running when I push new code to my main branch. And so I am defining what kind of system that this job is running on. I've just decided that Ubuntu is a good option. I am checking out code from my Git repo. This is something that is built into GitHub Actions. We'll pull my code down to this environment. I'm going to go ahead and install the latest version of GGT globally on this machine here. And then I'm going to go ahead and push. I will give it the name of my app, which is tag products automagically. So I'm going to push that code to the staging environment. So I'm using that staging flag here. I am just going to go ahead and force. So that means even if things are out of sync between staging and my main branch, normally if I were just doing GGT dev or GGT push without force, I would have to resolve some changes first. Force is just going to push whatever is on my main branch in Git onto my staging branch. Allow unknown directory allows us to make this change from Git. And what it's really doing is when I pulled down my Gadget project locally, I got this .gadget file, and this contains a bunch of type definitions and my bundled code and such. We're not pushing this to GitHub by default. It is included in my git ignore file. So this allow unknown directory is just allowing us to actually push our code from Git without that .gadget file to my staging environment. I am going to need a GGT token in order to do this. So I'm going to need to pass in a token value, and that's just so that I don't have to log in somehow. We need some way to authenticate this GGT call. We don't want anyone just being able to push code to our staging environment. So we're going to use this token to do that. Finally, after we've actually pushed our code to staging, I'm not going to run tests yet. I am just going to deploy right to production. So we can use GGT deploy. Once again, we're specifying the same app. Our environment, in this case, we're specifying what environment we're pushing to production from. So this is going to be our staging environment. Force is similar, just push whatever's on staging to production. And allow unknown directory is going to do something similar, where we are just allows us to force push no matter what is on staging. And once again, because that is a GGT command, we do need to pass in that token. So maybe that's the next thing we should do. I can go back to my Gadget app and generate a GGT token. Now, I am just going to point something out quickly. Now that we have unlimited development environments, there are going to be some things, and we will see this in a bit when we get to running tests. If I go to settings and pick something like environment variables or API keys, I already have an API key for this environment, for example. These are going to be environment specific. So it's important, if you do want an API key for a certain environment, you need to go create a new API key for that environment. And that's just because it's in this settings panel. You see we have this environment drop down here. If I go back to my actual app kind of name up here in the top left, I see I'll have some other app-wide options. So that's for modifying my app domain, forking an app, deleting an app, or the one I intentionally skipped over, CLI tokens. So these are going to be the tokens that I can use to authenticate my GGT requests in GitHub Actions so that I don't have to manually sign in. So I'm going to go ahead and generate a new token. I'll give it a name. I'll just call this CI runner. Click the little check mark. Reveal my token. Do not worry, I will delete this as soon as this webinar is finished. And I can just go ahead and copy this value. And then I'm going to go back to GitHub. And in order to pass in this value as a secret, I need to go to settings, secrets and variables, and then actions. And on this page, I can either add secrets, which are encrypted, or variables, which are just plain text for non-sensitive data. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new repository secret. I will paste in my secret, and I will enter my secret name, which is just going to be GGT token. You can see we can pass in secrets like this. If I had something that was a variable, I could just go vars, but this is a secret. So I will copy GGT token. I will add that secret, and we are good. So I will just note, this is how I'm passing in an environment variable that is going to be used for this shell, for this bash call. It's going to be a little different when we want to run tests, but I will once again walk through that in a bit. So this looks pretty good. I think this process should run. Now I just need to push this workflow file to GitHub, and it should run my first action. So if I just go git status, I see I have the .github folder, so I'll just go ahead and add that. Commit, add a new workflow. And if I push, excellent. Let's go back to GitHub and check it out. If I go to code, I see I have my workflow file now. And if I go to actions, I see that I actually have a running action now. So that's all that's really required to start off this CI/CD process. I can go ahead, click on this workflow or this running process. I can actually click on the job itself, and I can see all of the different steps that I've defined. So you see there's setup job, checking out my code, installing GGT, pushing code. All of these are just the names of the steps I defined within my job. So right now, it already pushed whatever code I had to my staging environment, and it is deploying to production. So that's pretty groovy. Let's test it out with an actual change now. So I'll just go back here. I'm just going to modify something in my front end because it's just easy to visually see. So if I go ahead and modify my, let's say, page name, I'll just go Riley's Keyword Manager. I can go ahead and check this out. I'll just refresh because there is a 3-minute timeout on the hot module reload. So I see Riley's Keyword Manager is here in my development app. If I refresh prod, it's just Keyword Manager. So now once I push this change to my main branch in Git, it should go ahead, push those changes to staging, and then automatically deploy for me. So let's test that out. Change page name and push that change. Awesome. Once again, we can go back to our actions page. I can take a look at my deploy process, and I should be deploying to production now. It'll just go through these steps. And once this is done, we'll check out our change in production, and then we can run some unit tests or do some test running. And this should just take a little bit. It's usually pretty quick to deploy all of our changes, which is pretty awesome. Fantastic. Things should be deployed. So now if I go ahead and refresh my prod app, Riley's Keyword Manager. So that is fantastic. My changes were automatically pushed to production. So I didn't have to click that deploy button. I just merged to my main branch. And now my main branch in Git is really the source of truth for my app. So that is good. Let's talk about running tests now. So I'm just going to go back to my app. And I actually already have some unit tests written. You can see I have in my API folder, I have created a test folder. I've got a stubbed API client set up, and I've got some tests for, my utility file here. It's just a very simple calling a util function. I have a test that's using my API client here to actually test my allowed tag create API. You can see that right here. And I have in my web folder another test file, and this is just some front-end snapshot tests. So I've got all of these set up locally. There's one thing I do want to point out. I'll go ahead and run these first, actually. So I'll just go yarn test. Just as a side note, we do have some documentation that tells you how to set up unit tests using vtest. So if I just go to my package.json, you see I've got a test command with vtest there. I've got the dependency installed. My vt config has some extra test stuff set up. All that's detailed in our docs. If I go ahead and run yarn test, though, that'll run my test command. My tests fail. And that's because if I go take a peek at my API client, this is the case where I need an API key in order to actually properly set up a client and run some of my API tests. I can do that. I've got an ignore file actually already set up, and I'm going to create an .env.local, and that's going to allow me to run my tests locally. So I'm going to do this in my local, and then I'll show you how to do it in Git or in GitHub. So this is where I need that API key. I did hint at it before, already had it created for this app. Go ahead and close my CLI token. So this is where I want to make sure I'm on my correct environment. I'm going to go ahead, create an API key, or I'm just going to do this, save it, and we're good. The reason I'm turning off access control here, normally when you create an API key, you may want to assign it to one of the roles you've created. I'm turning it off so that it has unrestricted super user access. This can be kind of dangerous, so it is something that you want to be aware of you're doing when you're doing it. The reason I am making this an unrestricted access key is because I'm actually using the internal API to do some test cleanup in my create test.js file. I'll point that out in a minute. So now I have my key. I want to put it in my env local file. I'm just going to go ahead and copy the name of my environment variable. And there we go. So now I have this variable locally, API key. It'll be used to initialize this API client. And if I go ahead and let's clear this first, run yarn test again, all of my tests pass. So that's fantastic. So there are a couple things that we want to change here in this client setup. First off, we need that test API key. We need a way to be able to get that up in GitHub Actions. We need to have a more dynamic environment selector. I don't just want to run tests against my development environment. I actually want to run them against staging. But I don't want to have to go ahead and modify this code file or do anything like that. So I'll want to use a variable for this client as well. So let's go ahead. Let's start with that. I'm going to go ahead and we can just, instead of doing development here, we can use another environment. I'll just go Gadget env. And if I go ahead and copy this, paste it here. Now I could probably, as a default, do something like this as well, just to have a fallback. I'm not going to do that for now. I'm just going to stop it. I will stop my tests, clear again, make sure they pass. Failing queue is not defined. I have a random queue hanging out there. Let's get rid of that. That looks better. Perfect. So my tests are passing locally. So I know that my environment variable is being passed in properly. Now I need to go ahead and run these tests. I need to be able to call run yarn test in GitHub. So let's go ahead and update our YAML file first. And I'll just close the terminal and move this over a bit. So in this first version of our pipeline, we only had one job called deploy. We just pushed right to staging and then deployed to production. I'm going to paste an updated version that breaks up the process into 3 different jobs. Now, there's a case to be made that this should just be one job. That's a-okay. I'm going to walk through the changes I made and just it's mostly just showing off some GitHub Actions stuff first, and then we will move forward. So once again, same job. It's called deploy to production, and it is going to run when I push to my main branch. I'm setting up some variables for my workflow first. So I'm actually just saying, hey, do you know what? My environment is staging. Whenever this workflow runs, I just want to run it on staging. And this is what I'm going to pass in to my environment. I want to make sure that my api.js file picks this up so that it points towards staging when the tests are run. And then there's my Gadget test API key. So maybe let's set this up. Once again, this is a secret in GitHub. So I can go ahead, go back to GitHub, go back to settings. This is going to be the exact same process we used to do the GGT key, GGT token. So it'll be a new repo secret. It's going to be a Gadget test API key. And I do not want to use my development environment API key. And that's when I say development environment, I mean my environment called development. I want to use my staging environment API key. So I can just go into settings, API keys. I'm going to create a new key. I'll call this CI runner. I'm going to give it full unrestricted access. I've copied the value. I'll press save. And that is the value I can paste here in GitHub. So now I have my test API key here. I need to actually run it. So like I mentioned before, I've taken my job, my one big job, and I've broken it up into 3 different pieces. So I now have a push, a test, and a deploy job. And so this breaks it up into 3 separate steps. It doesn't, like I mentioned before, it doesn't need to be broken up. You can notice that we are installing GGT in each of these steps. Maybe that's unnecessary. We're checking out the code in each of the steps. There's a lot of extra setup. This is going to be a little slower. I'm mostly just showing off how GitHub Actions works. So similar to before, this push is just going to push to our staging environment. And I will want to just replace app domain again with tag products automatically. So this first push is just going to push to my staging environment. Once again, we're using that new GGT push command, pushing to this app, pushing to our staging environment, and we're using that force and allow unknown directory flag. So that should just push my code from GitHub, from my main branch, to my staging environment. I then added this test job. Now, one thing to note is that I have a needs push. So by default, your GitHub jobs are going to run in parallel. But when I say that my test job needs push, it'll place it sequentially after that job. So that is terrific. That means, flipping around here. That means that my test job won't run until push is finished. So that just lines them all up. What I'm doing in my test job is I am going ahead, creating a new environment file, and that's going to be a .env. And I am just going to push or echo, place my Gadget test API key and Gadget env variables in that file. So these are the ones I defined at the top of my YAML here. I'm just adding them to this .env file that will be on my workflow machine. Once again, I'm going to install GGT. Now, this is that weird GGT pull command I mentioned before that I didn't have in my initial diagram. And this is here because I need to actually pull this .gadget folder from my staging environment to this test runner. If I go ahead and try to run my test without that .gadget folder, my API test, so once again, that's in my create.test.js for my allowed tag action, that will fail. It won't be able to set up my API client without that folder. So that's an important step that is a little tricky perhaps. It's not something you think of off the top of your head. Finally, I am just going to go ahead and install my project dependencies, so that's just yarn, and then I can actually call my yarn test. Finally, I have this deploy job, and this deploy job is just doing our deployment. Once again, it's a whole new job, so I need to check out my code again, reinstall GGT, and then I'm using GGT deploy to deploy this app from staging to production. I'm also just adding this allow problems flag. So this is something where I need to go ahead and deploy from staging to production. And it'll be flagged that my API key that has unrestricted access could potentially be an issue. If you're developing features that require that flag to be available, we just want to give you a warning. So I just allow problems to be able to deploy despite having that warning. And we should be able to actually see the warning. It's not there. If that's A-okay. Is it down here in the problems drawer? Right here. So it's this problem in the problem drawer. It has unrestricted access. So I'm just adding that extra flag to get by that potential problem. So this looks good to me. I should be able to go ahead and run this if I add it to Git. So I can see my differences. This is a nice part about source control. I see all the updates to my workflow file. I can see where I modified my API client initialization. So I'm just going to go ahead once again. Looks good. Now, it is saying env.local. I don't actually want to push .env.local to GitHub, so I'm going to add it here. And that is, I do not want to push my API key, especially because it has unrestricted access to GitHub. And that looks good now. And this should be run tests on, I'll just call it on action. And push that to my main branch. So now I click on actions. I can see run tests on action is working. It looks a little different. So it has each step from my job as separate steps here. And that's because we had that needs flag where test needs push and deploy needs test. So I can go ahead, look at these jobs individually. I see push is already good. We can move over to test. It is installing GGT. Once again, this is where just having it all in one job might be much quicker. We do get to see the results of that GGT pull command. So you can see it is pulling in this .gadget client or .gadget folder that we don't have in GitHub normally. So that is why we need that pull. It's going ahead and installing my app's dependencies, and then there we go. It ran my tests. All of my tests passed. That is fantastic. Now it will go ahead and deploy. It's going to set up the job and just push to prod. So I'm going to go ahead and do some testing. Awesome. Keeps flipping around. Let's do some testing. So there are a couple of test cases. First, let's just deploy a change to production. I'll once again update the name of my page here. I'll just call it Riley's Awesome Keyword Manager. And yeah. Make it more awesome. Push that change. And once again, we can see our action is running. Maybe instead of just looking at the actions this time, I can go ahead and take a peek here in my staging environment. So I am pushing my changes to this environment. So if I take a look at index, which is the file I'm actually updating, I see that my changes have already been pushed here. One other new thing about Gadget's unlimited environment change is that I actually get visibility into production as well. Now this is all the code running in production is minified and optimized. This is just a representation of what code is actually running. So I can see prod has not been pushed yet. It's gonna go ahead, run my tests, and then deploy those changes. The next thing I'm gonna try is breaking one of my tests so that my deployment fails. Just to show that, hey, if you have a broken test, it won't deploy. And then I'll wrap up just by talking about how we can also do this on a pull request, for example. Like you don't want to deploy on your pull requests. You just want to go ahead, push to an environment, run your tests. If the tests are green, then you can go ahead and deploy. Tests are taking a bit of time, almost a minute. Ooh, GGT took a bit of time to install, almost 30 seconds there. That's a little bonkers. But my tests are passed and my changes are going to go ahead and be deployed. So while that's going, I'm going to go ahead and break my tests locally. Pop this open again. I am just going to go into my utils. I'm just going to change the ID. I'm expecting my update call right here. This is just mocking out an update call on the Shopify client. So you can see connections, Shopify, current product, update. I'm just mocking out that function. So I'm going to make sure it fails. Let's just yarn test this. And I see some X's. So that is awesome. So I'm going to go ahead and push this to my main branch now. It will purposefully break my pipeline. It looks like this old build did succeed. So I can see Riley's Awesome Keyword Manager is now here. And if I go in and actually refresh my production app, this change has been pushed through as well. Fantastic. So let's go ahead and push this breakage now. Break CI. Push that change. And so what will happen is it will still deploy these changes to my staging environment. It's going to go ahead, run the tests. The test should fail and the deploy job should not run. There we go. Tests are running. We'll install GGT and we should be off to the races. Oh, speedy that time. So here we go. We should see a not big red X, but a red X. and running tests. And there we go. So that failed. So you see, if I look off to the left here, test has an X by it. That job failed. If I go back to my summary, we did not deploy. I get 2 errors that were detected. So this is actually my test error itself. I can take a peek here. It also highlights that the process completed with exit code 1. So in this case, my test is broken. I'll be alerted. I'll actually get an email about this, and I can go and fix my test before I deploy. So that is the general end-to-end how you can go ahead and use the GGT commands, how you can use multiple environments and source control to set up the CI pipeline for automated deployment and test running. There's one more thing I want to point out, and this is just a bit of a well, do you know what? First, I'll point out how we can do this on a pull request. I'm not going to go ahead and push it, but if you did want to run this on a pull request, for example, instead of push, I think it's just pull request. And instead of deploying, we can just not deploy. I believe that's all you'll need to do. Once again, if you want to refer to GitHub's own documentation about this, it should be pretty easy to modify. If you do have these jobs, pushing and running tests, split up into separate blocks, you can also build composite actions so that you don't have to copy the exact same YAML code or YAML configuration in multiple files. It can be shared between 2 different workflows, which is also pretty neat. Now, one thing that might come up, if you have any questions, feel free to ask questions in the chat. I don't see anything here, so I'll just keep going. One thing that is potentially a limitation is if you have a large team and you are all pushing merging into main at the same time. By default, GitHub is going to run these more than one action at a time, which means that you could be pushing to staging, someone else could push to staging, and you could have a bit of a conflict where tests are being run on the wrong code on this staging environment. So that's something to be aware of. GitHub does have a way to actually control concurrency of your workflows. So that is something that you'll want to look into potentially. There is maybe also the potential to have some multiple different Gadget environments. You do have unlimited. So there are some different solutions that you can use to get around that problem, but just be aware that it could be an issue. That wraps up this webinar. Thanks so much for joining. If you have any questions, I will be hanging around. You can just use the chat. Otherwise, I'm looking forward to the rest of Gadget's launch week. And be sure to tune in. Our CTO, Harry, is going to be doing a live build tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern. It's really awesome to watch Harry code, so I do advise that you check that out if you have the time. This will also be recorded and available on YouTube as well as Harry's build. So fantastic! Thanks again. Happy to answer any questions. There we go. The question slide, very important. Okay, I'm not really seeing anything in the way of questions here. I will just hang around. Feel free to enter in the chat if you have any. Otherwise, yeah. Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to shoot them in the chat. I've gone through. If you missed the webinar, that's a-okay. This will be available on YouTube to watch at your leisure. We also will have some documentation on setting up a CI pipeline yourself. So you can also check out our documentation if that suits your fancy. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, so I am going to go ahead and end the webinar. Thanks again for joining. Cheers.